For most of my life, I believed there was a finish line. I just had to push a little harder, hit the next milestone, and then I could finally rest within myself. That was the silent promise I kept repeating to myself on every exhausting day. And then, on the day I came close to several of those things I had chased so hard, I discovered a truth that no one had ever told me before. Stick around until the end, because what I'm about to share with you here might change the way you read what you're going through. Here's the truth, and it takes a while to settle into your body. You get everything you asked for, and the exhaustion stays. You finish the project that seemed like it was going to be the last one, and another identical inner silence shows up to take its place. You wake up in the apartment you dreamed of, next to the person you chose, with the career you built through so much hard work. And even so, at some point during that ordinary day, an absence rises up inside your chest that no achievement can answer. You open your banking app, see the balance, close the app, and the feeling that lingers isn't about money. You open the chats on your phone, see dozens of unanswered messages, and not a single one feels worth the effort of typing. You sit down to watch some show that everyone is talking about, and after 15 minutes you realize you haven't absorbed anything you saw on the screen. Your eyes were there, but you weren't. That disconnect is the central symptom. Life happening on the outside, and you behind a thick pane of glass, watching like someone viewing a movie in another language, with no subtitles, with no interest in understanding. And then it hurts. It hurts in an absurd way, with no visible cause, with no reason that makes sense to anyone else. For a long time, the structural logic of contemporary culture has treated this state as a problem to be pushed away, with more productivity or more distraction. And it's important to say this carefully. There are cases where professional support is essential, and nothing I'm about to say here replaces a careful clinical perspective. But there's a layer of this phenomenon that the clinic alone cannot reach. A layer that spiritual and philosophical traditions have been mapping for centuries, with a precision that's almost startling once you finally find the right texts. The mystics called this the desert. And the desert, in their language, wasn't a pretty metaphor. It was a literal description of an inner geography that nearly every human being undergoing transformation ends up passing through. Almost every serious spiritual tradition has its own version of this crossing. The Hebrews wandered for 40 years before reaching the Promised Land. Christ spent 40 days in the desert before beginning his mission. Buddha sat under a tree for long weeks, without eating, without distracting himself, without running from his own inner silence. The early Christian monks, in the 4th century, left the cities of Egypt and went to live literally in physical deserts, because they understood that there was something in the desert that the city could never offer. And this is no coincidence. There's something in the geography of stripping away that brings out what comfort buries. When nothing grows easily, when there's no noise to fill the gaps, when the landscape is the same for miles, a person begins to come face to face with what they had been pushing into the corner of their consciousness. That apparent emptiness isn't punishment, it's a mirror. Think for a moment about what these traditions were pointing to. It wasn't just the physical landscape that mattered, even though the landscape did matter. What mattered was what the landscape did to the person. In a city full of noise, it's easy to escape your own company. You go out, meet someone, chat, consume, distract yourself, forget. Every external sound fills a silence that might otherwise bother you from within. But in the desert, there's no such luxury. The desert hands you back to yourself, with no middlemen, and that handing back is at the same time a gift and a punishment. A gift, because it's the only real way to know yourself. A punishment, because what shows up in that mirror isn't always comfortable to look at. People are terrified of being alone with themselves, and that's why this crossing has always been feared. But those who had the courage to make it through came back with different eyes. They came back knowing things you can't learn in the city. Today, of course, most of us aren't literally heading off into a physical desert. We don't have to. The desert has come to us, dressed in different clothes. It shows up in a brightly lit apartment, with the TV on and the phone within arm's reach, and yet the person feels an inner dryness that none of those stimuli can quench. It shows up in a crowded restaurant, in the middle of loved ones, and the person suddenly finds themselves far away from everything, watching the scene as if through a window pane. It shows up on a Sunday evening, after an ordinary day, with no apparent reason, and the person feels that something deep inside them is shedding its skin. The contemporary desert is internal, but it has the same symbolic geography as the literal desert. The same rules, the same risks, the same possibilities of return. What few people realize is that this crossing rarely happens when life is actually bad. It usually arrives at a strange, almost ironic moment, when the person looks around and everything seems to be in order. The job is stable, the bills are paid, the loved ones are nearby, and even so, from some muffled place inside the chest, a silence rises that doesn't fit into what life has built. That's exactly when the strangeness begins. Because if everything were going wrong, it would make sense to feel what you feel. But with everything seemingly fine, the person starts to doubt their own sanity. They wonder what's wrong with them, why they can't be happy with what they have, why they always need to want something more, even without knowing what it is. I understand perfectly when you ask yourself those questions in the middle of the night, with the phone's light hurting your eyes, without the courage to admit out loud that the life you've built is no longer serving you. It's not weakness to feel this. It's not a character flaw. It's a symptom of a process much older than you imagine. The explanation is simpler than it seems, even though it's not comfortable. This emptiness arrives when your inner self has grown beyond the form that had been containing it. The life you put together served you up to a certain point. It got you here. It taught you what it needed to teach you. It protected you while you needed protection. But there came a moment when you became bigger than it. The clothes got tight, and the symptom of that tightness isn't physical pain. It's that diffuse emptiness that seems to have no cause. Nothing on the outside has changed, but inside you something has finished a cycle. And finished cycles, when they're not acknowledged, turn into weight. The weight of living a form of life that no longer matches who you're becoming. This is subtle, but it's constant, and it builds up over months, over years, until it bursts open as this silent exhaustion you feel right now. Generally, this phase announces itself long before it shows up in full. You ignore the early signs because they seem small. A new irritation with situations you used to tolerate, a growing boredom in conversations that used to interest you, a fatigue that shows up even after a good night's sleep, a new difficulty getting excited about things that used to work for you. Those signs are your innermost core whispering that something needs to change. If a person listens early, the transition is gentler. If they ignore it, the signs get louder until they become the absolute silence of the crossing. It's like the body, which gives mild signals before truly getting sick. Those who listen adjust in time. Those who don't are forced to listen when the inner wear and tear has already taken on another size. This is where we need to meet the mystic who may have described this state with the most precision in Western history. We're talking about Saint John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish Carmelite friar, author of a work called Dark Night of the Soul. For him, there was a moment in the inner journey when the person who had once felt comfort in their beliefs and in their affections suddenly lost all that sweetness. Prayers became dry. Symbols seemed hollow. The presence of the divine, once perceived as warmth, turned into absence. And what might look like a crisis of faith was, according to him, exactly the opposite. It was the moment when the divine was working within the person in such a deep way that it no longer fit into the language of the senses. The darkness wasn't abandonment. It was a closeness so intimate that the person could no longer recognize it. That's it. The presence hadn't disappeared. It had simply grown too big for the old receptors. This idea may seem strange at first, but think about it. When a child is loved from a distance, they perceive love as a gesture, as a toy, as a visible touch. But when the relationship matures, love comes to inhabit more subtle places, places that don't fit into easy expressions. Something similar happens, according to St. John, in the spiritual life. The early stages are full of signs, strong emotions, vibrant certainties. Later, When the inner self grows, those signs begin to be taken away, not because something has gone wrong, but because the person needs to learn to trust in something that no longer depends on sensation. The dark night, then, is the phase in which all the old spiritual language goes silent, and the person has to cross a silence that seems unbearable, until they discover that within that silence dwells a much deeper communication than they were able to hear before. Almost 400 years later, on the other side of Europe, a Swiss doctor named Carl Gustav Jung would arrive at surprisingly similar conclusions, although by way of psychology. Jung spent decades studying the texts of medieval alchemy, not for the chemistry itself, but because he saw in them a symbolic map of the process of inner transformation. The alchemists spoke of phases of the work. The first of these was called nigredo, a Latin word meaning blackening. It was the phase in which the matter, inside the vessel, had to darken and dissolve before any real transformation could happen. Jung realized that this didn't just describe lead turning into gold in a laboratory. It described with terrible precision what happens to the human psyche at decisive moments in life. And on this topic, check out the first pinned comment, Alchemy and Archetypes. For Jung, the personality we build up over the first decades of life is necessarily full of masks. We learn to be who our parents needed us to be. We learn to smile in the right situations, to desire what was socially approved of, to push behind the scenes everything that might get in the way of our belonging to the group, to adjust our voice, our gestures, and even our breathing to fit into what was expected of us. This process is even useful for survival, but there comes a moment, generally between 30 and 50 years of age, when this entire structure begins to creak. The masks no longer fit, ambitions don't satisfy, certainties lose their weight, and the person enters a kind of inner symbolic decomposition, in which what they thought they were begins to come undone, without what they truly are having yet emerged. That interval, that hole between the old identity and the new one, is exactly the nigredo. It's that crossing dressed up in modern vocabulary. Jung observed this process in hundreds of patients, successful people, intellectually active, socially well-positioned, who suddenly entered a phase of radical questioning of everything, and he realized that this phase wasn't pathology. It was a task that human beings seem to have in the second half of life. In the first half, the person needs to build a functional self, capable of operating in the world, capable of earning money, capable of relating, capable of taking up a place. In the second half, this constructed self needs to be revisited. It needs to be questioned at its foundations. It needs to be refined. What was glued on from the outside needs to be separated from what was your own. What was taken on out of fear needs to be distinguished from what was chosen out of truth. This work of separation is painful, and it's exactly this work that's done in the nigredo. And maybe here it's worth pausing for a moment, because when you read this, a curious feeling can hit you. A mix of recognition and discomfort. It's the feeling of discovering that what seemed exclusively yours, intimate, even shameful, has already been described by others, centuries ago, in other languages with other names. You're not making up this inner silence. You're not being weak. You're stepping onto terrain that has already been walked by many people before you. And part of the relief begins to come from there, from the realization that there's a lineage for what you feel. That there are people who have already mapped this terrain and left useful notes on the stones. You're not the first one to discover that the life you built isn't enough, and you won't be the last. But most people, when they enter this phase, don't recognize where they've entered. They think something has gone wrong. They think they need to rush to fix it. And that's when the cycle of modern escapes begins. Because the structural logic of the culture we live in has a well-oiled engineering for preventing anyone from being alone with themselves for more than 5 minutes. The phone vibrates with every notification. The TV has thousands of hours of content. The platforms offer infinite scrolling. The apps promise new encounters with every tap. The headphones isolate even the sound of footsteps on the street. Each of these stimuli is an extremely polite way of preventing the encounter with what silence would bring to the surface. And when the absence begins to appear, it's exactly to these resources that the person runs first. It's natural. It's human. But it's also what keeps this phase lasting much longer than it would need to. You're not exaggerating when you notice this pattern in yourself. Think about how many times in the past week you opened your phone without actually looking for anything. Your hand went on its own. Your thumb scrolled. Your eyes were bombarded by images you didn't ask for, opinions you didn't seek out, other people's lives that have nothing to do with you. And when you put the device down, 10 or 30 minutes later, the initial absence hadn't disappeared. It had only been buried under a new layer of noise. Jung wrote, in a sentence that deserves to be read several times, that what we don't face as consciousness returns to us as fate. In other words, what we refuse to look at head-on ends up showing up in the circumstances of our life, in the wrong choice of partner, in the repetition of the same kind of professional problem, in chronic exhaustion, in the irritability that won't go away. The silence we run from grows bigger. The silence we face begins to teach. And there's an important subtlety here. It's not that resting or distracting yourself are bad in and of themselves. The problem isn't the phone screen or the show on TV. The problem is the compulsive use of these resources as anesthesia for something that's asking for attention. There's a huge difference between someone who watches a movie with presence, choosing that movie carefully, living through that narrative, and someone who turns the TV on in the background just to avoid being in silence at home. The first person is resting. The second person is running. The same object, two completely different uses. And this phase detects the difference. When escape is the engine, even leisure is tiring, even fun feels heavy, even consumption loses its appeal. Because nothing that's coming in is being processed. It's just being piled on top of the original restlessness. When you notice this pattern in yourself, it's tempting to judge yourself. But judging doesn't help. What helps is understanding that this escape behavior is ancient, it's human, and it has been heavily reinforced by the contemporary cultural dynamics you grew up in. No one taught you how to sit in silence. No one taught you how to hold space for boredom. No one taught you that there are phases of life when the best thing to do is literally less. Our emotional vocabulary has been trained to detect a problem every time discomfort appears. And so discomfort is treated with more stimulation, more activity, more entertainment, more outside opinions, more noise. But the discomfort of this phase doesn't respond to stimulation. It responds paradoxically to acceptance, to presence without escape, to staying with what is being felt without trying to switch the mental channel. And here we need to make a delicate distinction, because it's vital. The dark night of the soul and deep clinical exhaustion are not the same thing, but they can overlap. Deep exhaustion, in the clinical sense, has biological and neurochemical components that often require therapeutic treatment and specialized medical care. Nothing I'm saying replaces that care. If you feel like you've lost the ability to function, if there are very heavy thoughts that won't go away, if you can't function in your daily life anymore, seek professional help. That's courage, not weakness. What I'm describing is a symbolic and existential layer that may be present alongside other layers, and that also needs to be addressed through this other vocabulary. The simplest difference is perhaps this. Deep exhaustion tends to feel like a bottomless pit. The dark night tends to feel like a crossing without visibility, but with direction. There's a hidden meaning in the dark night, even when the person can't perceive it in the moment. I know it's hard to hear this when you're inside the silence, but the meaning is there. And when that meaning starts to be glimpsed, even if only in flashes, the relationship with one's own suffering changes. The pain doesn't go away, but it stops being absurd. It stops being pure dysfunction. It becomes a passage, and a passage is crossed in a different way. Someone who finds themselves in a desert and knows they're in a desert can learn to ration water, can learn to read the stars, can learn to recognize the subtle signs of the landscape, can learn to take care of their feet. Someone who finds themselves in a desert thinking they're in a place that should be a green pasture, that person suffers twice. They suffer the crossing and they suffer the wrong interpretation of the crossing. And a large part of contemporary torment, I'll go ahead and say, is exactly this second kind of suffering. The wrong interpretation of a necessary phase of life. The symbolic closure of the old self is the technical term for what happens in this phase. And it's an important name, because the word closure clarifies without scaring. Something is ending inside of you. That's true. It's not a false alarm. It's not an exaggeration. The ego you built up to this point, made of your parents' expectations, of comparisons with your peers, of the praise you sought, of the fears you developed to protect yourself, all of that is starting to stop. Because this structure, however useful it has been for getting you here, is not going to take you where you need to go now. Life is asking for a more whole version of you, more truthful, less negotiated with fear. And the road to that version inevitably runs through the partial demolition of the previous version. That's why it hurts so much. It's not pointless pain. It's demolition pain. It's the pain of someone watching a house come down that took decades to build. And even though the new house will be better, even though it will have more light, more space, more air, no one sees the new house when the rubble is still there, in the middle of the path, dirtying their shoes. I know it's hard to hear this, but the rubble is part of the construction. It's not a flaw in the project. It's a stage. And whoever wants to skip the rubble stage usually ends up living forever in a collapsing house, without the courage to truly tear it down or the energy to renovate it honestly. There's no shortcut. There's an important question worth asking here, not to be answered now, but to be left vibrating inside you. Who is the person you haven't been yet, but who needs to be born through this phase? Not the upgraded version of the current person, not the same person with more money, more success, more recognition. I'm talking about something else. Someone your current life still cannot contain. A set of qualities, choices, and ways of being in the world that needs space to come to the surface. That someone is who's trying to be born right now. And the old self, with everything good and everything limited about it, is getting in the way of that birth. Not out of malice, just because the old occupies the place of the new, and until it leaves, the new can't enter. Most people resist this inner farewell because they confuse it with real death. But it isn't. The ego that dissolves isn't your body, isn't your life, isn't your story. It's just a layer built on top of you. A layer useful in a certain phase, dispensable in another. When that layer falls, what remains isn't less. It's more. More root, more essence, more of what you always were, before you learned to be who the world told you to be. The mystics called this the return to the true name. Jung called it individuation. The names change. The experience is the same. And it only happens when the person stops defending the old structure and lets time, with its cruel patience, do the work that needs to be done. Here we arrive at an important turning point. And before we move on, let this be a marker, because what I'm about to say changes the whole game. If you've been running from this crossing your whole life, you may never have heard this. But the silence of this phase, that silence that seems unbearable at first, is also a teacher. And it's a teacher unlike any other you've had up to now. You've had teachers who spoke with words. Silence teaches without words. You've had teachers who showed answers. Silence shows you questions you've spent your whole life avoiding. You've had teachers who filled you up with information. Silence empties you of the leftover clutter in your head. And it's only in that emptying that there finally appears space for something true to live inside you. St. John of the Cross insisted that, in the dark night, the person is instructed without images, without ideas, without sensible consolation. It may sound like ancient religious language, but the translation to the now is direct. It's as if there were, inside each one of us, layers that can only speak when the outside noise quiets down. Layers that know things about your life that your conscious mind will never be able to put into words. Old intuitions, effective memories that were left half-finished, directions that your heart has already pointed to many times, and that you never wanted to listen to, because listening would mean disturbing entire structures. These layers only speak softly, and they only speak when the rest is in silence. This phase, with its apparent emptiness, is the only place where these voices begin to become audible. But here's the part nobody tells you. When the old symbols that held up your life begin to lose their shine, this is experienced as a crisis. You were raised within a religion and you realize that those rituals don't move you the way they used to. You believed in a professional project, and you realized that career has become a soulless routine. You idealized a certain kind of relationship, and you realized that what you were living there wasn't love. It was a tired contract. When this happens, the first reaction is usually to think that something has broken inside of you, that your faith has weakened, that your dedication has cooled, that your heart has hardened. But Jung had a completely different reading. For him, when old symbols stop working, it's not your inner self that is worn out. It's your inner self that has grown beyond those symbols. And it's demanding, with the silent stubbornness that every truly lived life has, new symbols. Symbols that don't just come from the outside, inherited, copied, but that spring from somewhere more intimate, more original, more your own. This helps explain a feeling that's very common in this phase. The feeling that other people's words, even the well-meaning ones, even the deep ones, slip right off. You read books that used to crack your chest open, and they sound generic. You hear advice that would once have guided you, and it sounds small for the size of what you're going through. It's not arrogance. It's not closing off. It's that, at this moment, no borrowed symbol can get into your bloodstream anymore. You need to find your own. And finding your own takes time. It takes precisely the crossing. The loneliness this phase imposes is perhaps one of the hardest parts, because you're still surrounded by people. You go to work, you go to birthday parties, you reply to messages, but there's something inside you that's no longer keeping up with the collective pact. When others get excited about subjects that used to excite you, you feel a silent distance. When someone tells you about a problem, you find yourself listening from far away, noticing that the problem told that way shows that the person hasn't yet accessed deeper layers within themselves. And you can't say that. You can't explain it. Trying to explain it feels like translating the untranslatable, and each frustrated attempt leaves you even more isolated. It's completely valid to feel that loneliness. It's not a defect of sociability. It's a natural consequence of someone who is changing shores while others are still busy on the old shore. The early Christian mystics back in 4th century Egypt had a word for this. They spoke of recollection, not as abandonment of the world, but as a strategic withdrawal. They understood that there are transformations that only happen in withdrawal, that the collective noise drowns out, and that being alone, in certain phases of life, isn't social deviance. It's being with what matters most in you. Being alone with yourself, without distraction, is one of the rarest and most demanding experiences of human existence. Almost no one can hold it. Whoever holds it comes back different, and generally comes back knowing things that the rest of the world will still take a long time to discover. Now we come to the most counterintuitive moment of all, and this is where most people get it wrong. I myself have gotten it wrong many times, so I say this with humility. The automatic intuition of someone in this crossing is to want to get out as fast as possible. Walk faster, read more self-help books, move to a different city, switch professions overnight, start 10 new projects, do 10 different retreats, look for a guru, a miracle therapy, a new religion, a new love that erases the previous one, a new certainty to replace the old one that ended. All of this looks like movement, but it's sophisticated escape. It's the same scrolling on the phone screen, now dressed up in spiritual clothing. And the result, after months or years, is that the person realizes they've been walking in circles, still in the same crossing, just more tired. That's it. The mystics said something much simpler, and for that very reason much harder. You don't get out of this phase by walking faster. You get out by stopping. You get out by sitting in the sand. You get out by letting it do its work on you. The hurry is exactly what keeps the person spinning in circles. This phase isn't a problem to be solved with effort. It's a crossing that asks for surrender. And surrender is a word that frightens contemporary cultural dynamics, because we've been taught that winning means muscling through. But there are victories that only happen when the person stops fighting against the right process. And allowing the process to happen is, in itself, the greatest of actions. Go back for a moment to the alchemical image of the Negredo. The matter is there, inside the vessel, blackened, in putrefaction. The experienced alchemist doesn't interrupt the process. He doesn't take the matter out of the vessel to try to wipe it clean with a cloth. He knows it has to rot all the way through. That the rotting is part of the refinement. That trying to speed it up ruins everything. Alchemical patience is a virtue lost in our time. Our culture wants results yesterday, wants transformation in 7 days, wants enlightenment by monthly subscription. And the human being doesn't work on that beat. They have their own time, which is slower, more stubborn, more serious than any productivity schedule. Letting yourself dissolve into what needs to be dissolved is, perhaps, the bravest gesture an adult can make. And it's a silent gesture. No one applauds. No one notices from the outside. To the world, you're just quieter, more introspective, maybe slower. But inside you, something enormous is happening. The illusions you built about who you were supposed to be are coming apart. The borrowed identities are loosening from your body. The shoulds that you carried for decades are starting to lose their weight. I'm not saying this to make you anxious, but to wake you up. What's being dissolved wasn't you. It was a version of you that needed to fall so that something more truthful could appear. You're not being undone. You're being cleaned of what was already dead and was still pretending to be alive inside of you. Here it's important to say something many people don't say. This crossing is not eternal. It feels eternal while you're inside it, and that sense of eternity is one of its traps. But it has an end. Or rather, it has a border. There's another shore. And the first signs that you're approaching that border are usually so subtle that you almost don't notice them. One morning, for no apparent reason, the coffee tastes a little sharper. A sunset that you barely used to notice holds your eyes for a few extra seconds. An old song plays on the radio, and something in your chest answers, even if faintly. A child laughs in the street, and for an instant you laugh along. Without deciding to laugh, these small returns of color aren't euphoria. They're not a celebration. There's something quieter. The alchemists called the phase that follows the Negredo albedo, a word that comes from white, from whitening. It's a softer, washed-out light that begins to seep in slowly. Jung described this moment as a subtle reorganization of the personality, in which the person begins to recognize themselves again, but in a different way. Simpler and less dependent on outside approval, more tolerant of themselves and more capable of presence without performance. It's not that the person becomes euphoric, it's that they become inhabited in a new way. The signs of coming out of this crossing also include other small changes that no one teaches you to look for. A clearer intuition about what needs to be done next. A different kind of compassion for those who are still lost, without feeling superior, just a kind of recognition. A new ability to tolerate conversations that used to be hard, to listen without reacting, to disagree without fighting, to stay quiet when staying quiet is more honest than speaking. A natural reduction in interests that used to take up hours of your time, and the appearance of others that feel denser, more essential. You start to notice that you've lost your taste for certain company, and you discover that this isn't coldness, it's just an inner readjustment. The right people for this phase haven't arrived yet, or are arriving at a different pace, and that's okay. And, above all, a feeling that's hard to describe, but unmistakable for those who feel it. The feeling that you've reunited with yourself after years of absence. Like someone coming home after a trip that lasted too long, and realizing that the home was there the whole time, waiting. You didn't bring back someone new. You found again someone old, someone who existed beneath all the layers life kept gluing on, and who finally managed to emerge because this crossing peeled the layers off. The person who emerges is lighter, not because the problems have disappeared, but because they're no longer carrying the weight of pretending to be something else. Remembering that you're on sacred ground is the last gift this phase offers. Sacred not in the narrow religious sense, although it can be that too, but in the sense that it's ground where something important happens, where people truly transform, where ordinary people become whole people. The mystics, the philosophers, the deepest artists, all of them walked on this same ground. St. John of the Cross walked it in the 16th century and described what he felt so that others, centuries later, would know they weren't alone. Hume walked it in the 20th century and mapped the symbolic structure of the process so that we could read our inner experience with more precise vocabulary. You're walking it right now, in your life, in your home, in your daily route, on a piece of that same geography. There's a silent dignity in someone who agrees to cross this. A dignity that no one sees from the outside, and that maybe even you can't recognize while you're crossing. But it's there. It's in the small gestures of not running away. It's in the almost invisible courage of continuing to wake up, continuing to take care of the people closest to you, even when inside you a whole season of the year is on pause. That, in the silence of your days, is one of the highest forms of heroism there is. And the highest forms of heroism are usually invisible. That's exactly what marks them. The invisible lineage of people who crossed the same terrain before you doesn't manifest with applause. It manifests with discreet presence, in the pages of the right books, in the sentences that show up at the right moment, in the encounters that happen without warning. When you read the mystics, when you read the deep thinkers, you're doing something like plucking a long string that vibrates across time. They left letters for you without knowing you would exist. And you, when you read, close a circuit that has existed for centuries. That's one of the most serious consolations the tradition offers. You're not alone. You're accompanied by a silent multitude that has already passed where you are passing. And to close, here's an image that may help you hold on. Imagine someone crossing a real desert, with strong sun, sand as far as the eye can see, hot wind. That person doesn't know how much further it is, but they know that every step brings them closer to the shore. And they also know that this landscape is in some way sculpting them. The sun is clearing what needs to be cleared. The wind is taking away what needs to be taken away. The solitude is teaching what only solitude can teach. When they finally reach the other shore, they'll arrive lighter, more essential, more recognizable to themselves. They'll have lost what was excess and found again what was missing. And they'll look back at the arid landscape they crossed with a gratitude that no one who has never crossed it can understand. Maybe that's what is happening with you right now, and everything that seems like a lack of meaning, lack of taste, lack of color, may be exactly the work of this crossing doing what needs to be done. The dark night, said St. John, lasts as long as is necessary, and not a moment more. If this video found you in a difficult moment, I hope it has worked as an outstretched hand. Subscribe to the channel to keep following this kind of reflection, and consider becoming part of our membership club. Until our next meeting.